Hello, everyone. Good morning. I have a presentation of about 22 minutes or so, and I want to read it because I want to be precise in what I say, so bear with me. My presentation today looks at contemporary urban spatial practices that were generated in response to or by opportunities. Oops, this is loud now. Is that okay? You hear me better? Okay. So I'm going to talk about urban practices in the context of the economic crisis, austerity urbanism, the post-crisis city, and so on. And I will look at the promise of that many of them make for enhancing equality, inclusion, or democracy, and will comment on how this promise might be fulfilled, how it might be emulated or expanded, and what the possible limitations of these might be. I will start by saying a few things about method and methodology before moving on to describe three types of urban practices, and before then concluding with some general comments about these practices and the role of architecture, both as profession and discipline, which are two very distinct things. What follows is not a systematic study. Rather, in the spirit of Andrew Leach, the historian Andrew Leach, my method is one of extrapolating arguments from observations and practice, which encompass theory, education, and also professional practice, which I have made in recent years in very broad geographical contexts, ranging from North to South America, across Scandinavia and Europe, India and China, and so on. It is important also to state here that, and again I follow Andrew Leach here, that my notes are absolutely not universal, yet I also don't consider them unimportant. Needless to say, these observations have to be seen in the context of course, also my own personal history, and are also a reflection of my professional context in a university that likes to call itself engaged university. This in itself is not an unimportant framework, as it hints at the type of knowledge, production, and practice it also favors. One final note on method, to make the starting point of mine as clear as possible. The observations that follow are based on the distinction I make between thinking about architecture and thinking through architecture. I don't do what I do in order to make architectural practice better, although this might be a side effect. Instead, I'm doing what I do for its own sake. I'm interested to extend, and I quote the historian Andrew Leach again, disciplinary knowledge. Hence, here today, my interest is in extending architecture's disciplinary knowledge about spatial practice in an austerity context. So, I'll go very quickly over three different types of practice. I'm not going to say much to the slides that you'll see in the background. Very broadly, there are three types of practices, each of which have a series of subcategories. Type 1 is about urban practices that I will call sanctioned or guest practices. These are practices that have been allowed to take place by city authorities, by developers or other landowners, sometimes concerned with different formations of meanwhile use, let's call it filling a gap, literally and also metaphorically, until something else comes along, but sometimes also leading to the transfer or buyout of land by, in inverted commas, communities. Examples in this category of practice are often developed as co-production between citizens, community groups, and developers and city councils, an idea that in the UK at least, the head of social policy at the New Economics Foundation, Anna Coty, points out is very closely aligned to some of the key ideas behind the big society. So what we find with this type of practice is, theoretically at least, a reciprocal partnership between groups who would have normally provided stuff, let's say housing, health services, etc., and groups who were traditionally classed as users. And I would distinguish here between four different groups and strands. So you have the slides, and you can read what's on the slides later on. Class type 1A is meanwhile use as meanwhile use. So we can talk about empty shops or empty sites. meanwhile uses on empty sites urban practices as guests on other people's plots of land or property. Then there's the category which called better cricket pitch than an empty lot. Meanwhile, use a strategic sellout, often implemented by architects and designers. Community management is another category, which is about the transfer of management in terms of libraries to community groups. For example, you find it also in health centers or so on. Then there is community development through, for example, community land trusts. So people, a community, get together to buy land in order to manage and increasingly also develop their own assets, which could be housing, workspaces, food growing, etc. Then there's practice type 2, which I again provisionally call non-sanctioned or host practices. And this is about practices that could be squatting land or buildings, practices that could be designing or are designed as open source systems, practices that could be implementing different organizational structures. Some of these practices are articulated as resistance, others define themselves as wake-up call, or as a practice that ruptures normative thinking, or indeed some practices are stating that they are reinventing what is normal. And this approach also generally believes that all issues and problems could become objects of design processes and that another world can and should be designed. They might have emerged, again in the UK, in the context of big society or localism, but are historically and theoretically much bigger than the current narrow political frameworks. So ideas here precede the 2007-2008 crisis, but one could say that this crisis has intensified these practices since then. Generally, what brings them together is the idea, as the geographer Neil Brenner puts it, that things could be otherwise. And I distinguish, again, between three different variations. One is about occupation and squatting of land and buildings as a critique of enclosure and privatization. This is then used as sometimes community gardens, resource spaces, or housing. This practice has not been generated by the crisis, but it has arguably become much more common over the past 5 or 10 years. The second one is about the design of organizational structures, social enterprises, community interest companies, community land trusts, and this, of course, is Christina's practice, Studio Polpo. She might talk about this in a bit, or not. Then there's the conception of open source building systems, which you might have seen yesterday also in the example of WikiHouse, which sometimes comes also as a critique of professional architecture practice, its price tag, and also therefore reach. The third type of practice is concerned with ideas and the production of critical other imaginaries. And for me, this has two variations. The first one is concerned with politics with a capital P, approaches that are about campaigning, mobilizing, and developing different ideas through politics. This type believes in the state or other state-like structures as a powerful and sometimes only possible structure to bring about democracy, equality, and justice. It can come in the form of the politicization of justice, the overt critique of localism agendas, big society policies, and also austerity policies. It's often outright oppositional. Rather than concerned with projects, this type is concerned with processes or systems. It is about rethinking equality on a systemic level. Practices challenge the austerity brand, arguing that through different planning, including renationalization and public ownership, austerity measures would not be necessary. So this type of practice is about rethinking equality on a much more systemic level. It is not necessarily a spatial practice, but sets the parameters for spatial practice. The second variation is an approach to urban practice that stems from an intellectual interest to understand how space is produced. This is generally about critical reflection on practices through writing, debate, talking, or the development of different ways for understanding the city and the development through other imaginaries. This type of practice is less interested in a product. Yes?
Sorry, can you just slow down a little?
Okay. I'm very happy to pass on these notes later on as well, yeah? I just want to give a very brief overview of these practices before I come to a discussion, which, yeah, but I can't slow down. No, that's fine, okay. Okay, type 3b is less interested in a product or design object than the type I discussed before, but is interested in making things, let's say, injustices, inequalities, hidden infrastructures, or design making structures, unknown land ownership structures visible. And I understand type 3 of urban practice as the fundamental starting point for the non-sanctioned practices that I've discussed under type 2. In fact, I think it's an essential starting point for any investigation, material or otherwise. So, discussion. So let's have this initial question in mind. Is a cricket pitch always better than doing nothing? All of these practices that I've just outlined very briefly have been developed or have intensified over the past 8 or 9 years. They have been and are being also articulated, I mentioned this in the beginning, as practices that will enhance equality, inclusion, or democracy. They sit within this wider framework of localism. So are any of these spatial practices hailed as being able to provide different, bottom-up, civic, common, co-produced models succeeding in enhancing equality or democracy? Well, it depends a little bit on how we define democracy. If we define democracy as, and I quote from the Marxist dictionary, a political system of rule by the majority, end of quote, a system that is participatory and overcomes the division between mental and manual labor, as well as the division between legislative and executive powers. None of these practices that have emerged achieve this, at least not on a substantial scale. But you could argue, of course, that this is the fundamental crux, the issue of scale. So whilst hailed at democratic, many of these sanctioned practices, which I just bundled up in type 1, are intensely undemocratic in their very setup. So consider, for example, the notion of co-production that is so very popular at the moment. Often upheld as a process that will lead to autonomy and better solutions for communities, it has been described also as a neoliberal mechanism, a low-budget version of the public-private partnerships, the PPPs or PFIs, that that we've seen emerge in the late 1990s, early 2000s, in particular in relation to hospital buildings and school buildings. So what is celebrated by the Conservative government in England as a shift of power to the people, in inverted commas, is, when you look at the bigger picture, not about the shifting of power, but only a partial shifting of responsibility. This is the case, for example, with the community-managed libraries mentioned earlier, which also has happened in Sheffield, of course. The power of us is also, let's not forget this, a very neoliberal project. Of course, we could argue that many of the practices I talked about, from meanwhile use to community land trusts, might enhance the setup of local decision-making structures democratically, if democracy is understood as a process whereby a certain group of people decides, and I quote again from the Marxist dictionary, quote, amongst themselves by consensus what and how it should be done. Yet, even if things are done collectively, if they are decided collectively, managed or developed, the low-budget practices and the volunteer work that goes into them still arguably provides an arm's-length response to austerity that, as the critical geographers Hannah Hildebrand and Anna Richter write, and I quote, neatly fits into the neoliberal repertoire of shifting responsibilities downwards, devolving the cost of austerity to lower scales. The urban scholars Tom Moore and Kim McKee have argued that the government's declared aim of decentralization and dispersion of power through the localism agenda, and I quote them, will turn out to be a survival of the fittest, where those with the time and affluence to engage in civic action benefit, while marginalized populations remain on the fringes. In a similar vein to more explicitly pop-up structures, the temporary meanwhile uses as much as the other semi-permanent community management structures can be said, as Frank Tonkiss does, to be integrated into an austerity agenda so as to keep vacant sites warm while development capital is cool. So very often urban practices move onto an empty site, do something nice, do something pretty, everyone's happy, but it also keeps this site warm for further development for the developer. And in that way, they serve the needs also of late capitalism, and they turn, and I quote Tonkiss again, coolness and spontaneity into consumerism, and effectively become a distractor from truly emancipatory action and also justice for all. I'm still with the question of democracy. So the fragmentation of efforts is another issue in this context. We've entered a world where projects come from a production line. The focus on projects in practice. We do one project after another, one festival after another, project here, project there, project everywhere. Yeah? Projects come from a kind of line. The focus on projects, on a co-housing project here, on a community garden there, on another pretty intervention there, or a squad there, means that even despite their often very networked nature and their multiplication aspirations, movements and their aims are splintered. So we have a total fragmentation of stuff. And this is by no means incidental. The urban scholar Margaret Meyer observes that municipal policies are consciously fragmenting and deepening divides in an effort to undermine collective action towards equality. The often isolated nature of projects also often means that many of them, if they sit within a bigger historic trajectory, have lost the radical edge they used to entail. So it is worth mentioning then also the self-representation of practices in journals, articles, and beyond, often not even acknowledging the obvious polylemmas, the economic, political, cultural interdependencies they are working within. I would consider this, beside this quite questionable context of democracy, as one of the key problems within urban practices these days. In these journals, articles, and publications, the possible complicity, if we want to use this word, in neoliberal mechanisms is substantially downplayed, or the relative importance of actions exaggerated. We find descriptions of micro-practices on street and neighborhood scales discussed as, and I quote, local expressions of resistance to the current urban form and likely to make urbanization processes more sustainable by integrating notions of equity. Other texts call about very one-off, super short-term action as wake-up calls to city dwellers, and others argue that we need to propose new tools that are adapted to our age of crisis and austerity. While all these practices within their micro-contexts might be necessary, and whilst it also might be necessary to produce new tools, I would argue that the severity also of the context of neoliberalization needs much, much more than this. And this is particularly the case in the context of universities and School of Architecture, which, rather than following a very pragmatist drift of duplicating practice within the universities, I would argue need to be nurtured as places where thinking architecture, and again I quote Andrew Leach, where thinking architecture outside of the profession and the exigencies of architectural practice needs to happen. So we need to focus also on the ideas behind architecture, need to understand why, what is happening, beyond the immediate concerns of a practice context. Of course, all these categories are somehow are somewhat fluid, the categories I discussed, and they're also obviously quite artificial. Given the very broad generalizations, a lot of details have also been lost. Conclusions and critiques might seem to you now rushed and maybe also incomplete, but are based, and I said this in the beginning, on my experience of such practices. And even though this experience might be quite wide, it is selective, of course. It is a very selective view on a very heterogeneous set of practices. But I want to pose this heterogeneity in a way as both hope and also curse. It is a curse because the power of heterogeneity, I believe, is not currently harnessed. Projects are celebrated as islands of otherness. Differences matter more than synergies in the examples that I'm discussing, and yet they are also spaces of hope, as David Harvey might call them, because they also show that other imaginaries might be or are indeed possible. So to overcome this curse-promise divide, if I'm using another false dichotomy, I am proposing to look back again to the urban scholar, sociologist Margaret Meyer and her assessment of the need of, for coalescences, I guess, between heterogeneous actors when it comes to social movements. So Meyer writes a lot about Occupy and the right to the city, and she looks at how different structures, how different scaled networks need to come together to create a much bigger narrative. And I would argue that the same is true also for spatial movements. She argues, Margaret Meyer argues, that one way to overcome this heterogeneity and fragmentation of actors as well as actions is for what she calls the privileged urban movements, those with capacity and power, both probably social media power and practice power, to stand up also for the other actors and add their leverage to the struggle against the exclusivity of neoliberal urbanism. And this, in fact, is very much about solidarity as it is about the power of scale. In order to make this possible, so if we want to succeed in bringing these diverse forces and practices together, however, much more work needs to be done, as Margaret Meyer points out also, to acknowledge and understand their difference. So it's a bit of a two-way thing. On the one hand, we need to understand much more what the differences actually are, but then these differences also need to be somehow acknowledged and together moved forward. This is, for me, also a direct call for architecture as a discipline to act, to work on these differences in order to expand the field of knowledge on how practices operate and what might add potentially also in a much more humble way than the way that it's currently being done. I would like to end with a few comments which concern the discipline and practice of architecture, but also education. So when the mechanisms of the neoliberal city mean that there are fewer and fewer sites and openings for collective struggle, these practices that I've outlined, as imperfect, messy, and flawed as they may be, keep some of these ideas of equality, democracy, and so on alive. Or, at the very least, they make visible managerially driven and homogenizing discourses. What these examples I talked about also do, even though they might be complicit with neoliberal principles, is to, and I'm quoting from the book Untamed Urbanisms Enacting Productive Disruptions, what they do is they rupture historical and contemporary representations of the urban. So they show us again that other forms of urbanism are possible. And while they might indeed do this, I maintain that this is also not enough. I maintain that there is a lack of criticality and reflexivity about the numerous architectural but also educational practices that surround us and that we are embedded in. The lack of criticality can also be seen in the pragmatist turn in education, which tends to simulate architectural practice and has led to programs and activities that are often complicit in serving remote and hidden agendas that are distinctively different to the needs and desires of those communities that these programs are actually working with. So we do things because our civically engaged university believes it's right to do so, potentially. Austerity urbanism is absolutely not business as usual, okay? It places distinct challenges on architecture as discipline and practice and exposes to an arguably higher degree architecture's continued dependency on external forces, on economics, on finance, on other actors that define how cities are done. It reveals also the deep and at the same time increasing social divides played out obviously in the recent vote for Britain to exit the European Union, or in fact the American election. So to state that spatial practices by themselves can overcome these divides would be cynical at best, yet spatial practices acknowledging the specific context they are operating within can, I believe, at the very least play a role in the formation of these coalescences that Margaret Meyer discusses, for example, in the context of social movements. So, in a context where the power of you, the power of us is perversely twisted to shift responsibility of action or non-action to individuals, I believe that careful and rigorous articulation of the issues at stake, and therefore the expansion of architecture as a discipline through thinking, is much more important than ever. Thank you. Oh, microphone. Forgot about it. Thank you.